Molten steel doesn't forgive hesitation, and it doesn't forgive rust on a skill you haven't used in years either. I've been a ladle operator at Kessler Steel Foundry for 17 years, the last 6 as lead operator on the number 2 furnace floor, and the specific discipline that's kept every person on my crew alive across those years is treating manual pour timing as a skill you practice deliberately, on purpose. Even on the hundreds of ordinary shifts where the automation handles everything perfectly and nobody would ever notice if you'd quietly let that particular muscle go soft. My name is Dagny Kessler. My father-in-law, Holt, founded this foundry 38 years ago, and for the last 5 years, even after handing daily operations to my husband, he's remained majority owner and the driving force behind PourSync, an automated pour timing and ladle control system he championed personally, installed across every casting line in the plant. This is a story about my father-in-law, about a system he built because he genuinely believed it had solved the single most dangerous, most skill-dependent part of this entire trade, and about a Thursday afternoon when PourSync's control hardware failed mid-pour, and the only thing standing between a controlled recovery and 4,000 pounds of molten steel going somewhere nobody wanted it was whether anyone still standing on that floor remembered how to finish a pour by hand. PourSync came online across Kessler Steel's casting floor 5 years ago, a system built to automate the single most demanding skill in the entire trade, the precise timing and controlled tilt of a ladle pouring molten steel into a mold, a task that had traditionally taken operators years of supervised practice to master and that even experienced operators occasionally got wrong, with consequences ranging from a ruined casting to a genuinely dangerous spill. My father-in-law had pushed hard for the system from its earliest proposal, arguing, correctly, that automated pour timing, driven by precise temperature sensors and calibrated tilt mechanisms, could execute a pour with a consistency no human hand, however skilled, could reliably match shift after shift, year after year. PourSync's timing is accurate to a fraction of a second, Dagny, he told me, more than once, standing on the same casting floor he'd worked since he was younger than I am now. It doesn't get tired at the end of a long shift, it doesn't have an off day, it executes the same precise pour every single time. That's a level of consistency this trade never had in 33 years before we installed it. I don't doubt the system's more consistent than any of us on our best day, Holt. What I'm telling you is that consistency during the thousands of pours where nothing goes wrong isn't the same thing as having somebody ready who can still finish a pour by hand the one time the system itself fails, and I don't think this floor is keeping that particular skill anywhere near sharp enough anymore, precisely because PourSync's been so reliable for so long that nobody's had a real reason to practice against. I want to be fair to what PourSync actually got right, because this isn't a story about a system built carelessly, or a father-in-law who'd stopped caring about the operators working his family's foundry the moment he moved from the floor into an office overlooking it. PourSync's precision had genuinely eliminated the specific kind of timing-related casting defects that had cost this foundry real money and, more than once in the decades before its installation, real close calls with operators executing a pour just slightly wrong, exactly the kind of careful, defensible engineering my father-in-law had poured his later career into. And I never once doubted he believed in it completely, right down to personally reviewing every pour quality report the system generated. What the system didn't have, and what nobody building it had fully understood the danger of, was any way to account for the specific, quiet cost of its own success, that 5 years of flawless automated pours meant 5 years during which fewer and fewer operators on this floor had any real occasion to practice the manual skill PourSync existed specifically to make unnecessary. A skill that, like any skill, degrades steadily and invisibly the less it gets used, right up until the exact moment a rare hardware failure finally demanded it back. I'd married into this family 6 years ago, not long before PourSync's installation, and I'd watched Holt across those years the way you watch someone who built something with his own hands long before he ever had a company large enough to need an office overlooking the floor instead of a place on it. He never once treated me as anything less than a full operator in my own right, certification and all, and I think that mutual respect was part of why our disagreement over PourSync's blind spot never once felt, to either of us, like a fight about whether the system deserved the trust he'd placed in it. I need to explain the specific practice this story turns on, because it's the actual center of everything that happened that Thursday afternoon, and because it's exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous discipline that a system built to remove a skill's necessity was never designed to actively preserve on its own. I'd kept up my own manual pour practice on a strict personal schedule since PourSync's installation, running a fully manual pour myself, deliberately, at least twice a month, on smaller test castings where a manual timing error carried real but manageable consequences rather than catastrophic ones, a habit I'd started almost by instinct in PourSync's first year and had never once let lapse across 5 years, even as I watched most of the floor's newer operators, hired well after the system's installation, go entire years without ever once executing a full manual pour outside their initial certification training. I'd raised this specific gap with my father-in-law nearly 18 months before this story's events, after a routine safety audit had flagged that 6 of our 12 certified operators hadn't performed a supervised manual pour since their original certification, some of them nearly 3 years earlier. PourSync's failure rate is exceptionally low, Dagny. The hardware's redundant across 3 independent control paths specifically to prevent exactly the kind of single-point failure that would ever require a full manual takeover mid-pour. I understand the redundancy, Holt, and I believe the failure rate's genuinely low. What I'm telling you is that exceptionally low isn't the same thing as zero, and the day it does fail, however rare that day is, I want every operator on this floor to have practiced this skill recently enough that their hands remember what to do without having to think about it first. I want mandatory manual pour drills reinstated for every operator, twice a quarter minimum, not just for new hires during initial certification. That's real furnace time and real material cost across 12 operators, 4 times a year, for a scenario the redundant hardware specifically designed to make vanishingly unlikely. I can't authorize that kind of ongoing cost against a risk this small without something more concrete than a general principle about skills fading. I remember leaving that meeting understanding exactly where Holt was standing, even as I disagreed with the conclusion he'd reached from there. He wasn't wrong that the redundant hardware made a full control failure genuinely rare, and I wasn't wrong that rare wasn't the same thing as impossible. The genuine difficulty was that the cost of maintaining a skill nobody expected to ever need again was easy to see and easy to measure in furnace time and material, while the cost of that same skill quietly eroding was invisible right up until the exact moment it wasn't. I still remembered my own training, 8 years before PourSync ever existed, an old lead operator named Franny standing behind me at the console for weeks, watching my hands, correcting my timing by fractions of a second until the motion stopped being something I thought about and became something I simply did, and I remembered her telling me once that a skill like this lived in your hands, not your memory, and that hands, unlike memory, needed regular work to stay honest. The afternoon this story turns on was a Thursday in September, a routine casting run on the number 2 furnace, PourSync executing what should have been an entirely ordinary automated pour of a 4,000-pound heat of molten steel into a large structural mold, an operator named Julio at the console, 11 months into the job and, like most of the floor's newer hires, having executed exactly 1 fully manual pour since his initial certification training. I was on the floor doing a routine walkthrough, not directly at the console, when I heard it, a specific triple beep alarm pattern I recognized instantly from PourSync's original installation documentation, a control hardware fault indicating the system's primary tilt control path had lost signal mid-pour, roughly 60% through the ladle's planned tilt sequence, molten steel still actively flowing and the automated system no longer reliably controlling the rate. Julio, control fault, primary paths down. You need to switch to manual tilt right now and finish this pour by hand, following the rate we practiced. I've never actually finished a live pour manually, Dagny, only the one certification run almost a year ago. I don't dash. His voice had the specific edge of someone whose hands genuinely didn't remember what his training had once, briefly, taught them. I'm coming to you now, stay calm, keep the tilt exactly where it is until I reach the console. I want to describe what I actually did next, because it fell squarely within my formal authority as lead operator and, honestly, within the one habit I'd never once let lapse across 5 years specifically because I understood, better than almost anyone else on this floor, exactly how much PourSync's own success had quietly eroded everyone else's readiness for this precise moment. I crossed the floor at a dead run, reaching the console within perhaps 15 seconds, taking manual control of the tilt mechanism myself while Julio stepped back, his hands visibly shaking, and finished the pour by feel, the exact muscle memory I deliberately kept sharp across 60 separate practice pours over 5 years finally doing the job it existed to do. The heat off the ladle pressed against my face even through my visor, the specific bright, restless orange glow of steel at poor temperature that never once stopped feeling dangerous no matter how many times I'd stood this close to it, and I found myself running the same silent count Franny had drilled into me 8 years earlier, not watching the tilt gauge directly but reading the actual flow itself, the exact width and color of the stream telling me more in half a second than any digital readout could have told me in 3. I eased the ladle through its remaining tilt sequence at a controlled rate, watching the steel's flow pattern the whole time for the specific visual cues that told me whether I was moving too fast or too slow, cues no dashboard displayed and that only direct, repeated practice ever taught a person to read correctly under real pressure. The pour completed cleanly, the casting mold filling correctly, 4,000 pounds of molten steel going exactly where it belonged rather than anywhere it didn't, a controlled recovery that took perhaps 90 seconds from the first alarm to the pour's completion and that depended entirely on one operator on that floor still having hands that remembered how to do this without PourSync's help. I stood at the console afterward with Julio, both of us catching our breath, the ladle now safely tilted back to its resting position, molten steel cooling in the mold exactly where it needed to be, the whole floor around us slowly returning to its ordinary rhythm the way a room does once everyone realizes the worst version of the last 2 minutes didn't actually happen. I froze, Dagny. I heard the alarm and I genuinely didn't know what my hands were supposed to do, even though I passed that certification pour clean almost a year ago. You didn't freeze because you're not capable, Julio, you froze because nobody's made you practice this since your certification, and a skill like this doesn't stay ready on its own, it fades exactly the way any skill fades when you go a year without touching it. That's not a mark against you, that's the exact gap I've been trying to get fixed for 18 months. I logged the full incident report myself, photographed the fault code display before maintenance reset it, and called my father-in-law directly rather than letting the report reach him secondhand through the normal chain. Holt drove out to the foundry himself within the hour, having heard enough over the phone to understand this wasn't a routine equipment fault, and I want to describe the conversation honestly, because it wasn't simple vindication for either of us, even with a genuine near miss and a shaken young operator standing in front of both our eyes. A primary control path failure mid-pour, and the operator at the console had executed exactly one manual pour in 11 months, Dagny. If you hadn't been on the floor and close enough to reach that console in 15 seconds, we're not talking about a close call anymore. I've been telling you for 18 months that PourSync's own reliability was quietly costing this floor the readiness it would need the one day that reliability failed, Holt. I didn't have anything beyond a safety audit number until this afternoon made the gap impossible to keep deferring. This wasn't the redundant hardware failing in some way nobody could have anticipated. It was exactly the rare scenario the redundancy was built to make unlikely, actually happening, on a day when the floor's manual readiness had eroded for 5 straight years without anyone treating that erosion as a real, ongoing cost. Which is exactly the gap I need to sit with, and I know that now in a way I genuinely didn't let myself believe 18 months ago, when you first raised it. I wasn't dismissing you because I'd stopped trusting your judgment, Dagny. I built PourSync because I spent 33 years on this floor before it existed, watching good operators occasionally get a pour wrong in ways that cost this company real money and, twice in my own career, came close to costing somebody their life. I wanted a version of this floor that didn't depend so completely on manual skill going right every single time, and I think I let that wanting outrun the fact that removing a skill's daily necessity doesn't remove the day you might still need it, it just makes that day considerably more dangerous when it finally comes. I know that, Holt. I'm not angry at you for wanting something steadier than manual pours alone ever gave this floor. I've heard your stories about the close calls before automation, same as everyone else who's worked here long enough. I'm telling you that the one time it mattered, 5 years of flawless automated pours had quietly made Julio's hands forget something they only ever learned once, and the only reason we're standing here talking about an incident report instead of something considerably worse is that I never let my own hands forget it. Specifically because I understood exactly what PourSync's success was costing the rest of this floor without anyone deciding to pay that cost on purpose. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at Julio, who was still standing near the console, and I watched Holt run the same calculation I imagined he'd been running since he first heard the fault code over the phone, the particular founder's math of how many other operators, across 5 years and however many shifts, might have been standing exactly where Julio had stood this afternoon without one lead operator's stubborn personal discipline happening to be close enough to reach the console in time. I keep thinking about the version of this afternoon where you'd been in the break room instead of out on the floor when that alarm went off, he said, finally, still watching Julio, or the version where you'd stopped keeping your own practice schedule years ago, once Porsink's record made it feel like an old habit nobody else bothered with anymore. I don't like sitting with how much of this afternoon came down to you personally deciding a skill couldn't ever become optional, no matter how good the system replacing it looked. I don't love sitting with that either, Holt. A system this good shouldn't need one operator's private discipline as its last line of defense before 4,000 pounds of steel goes somewhere nobody wants it. That's not a compliment to me, it's a description of exactly the gap we both need to close. You built something genuinely good across 5 years, and I've never once told this floor otherwise, but genuinely good isn't the same as complete, and I think somewhere in those 5 years you let yourself believe that a skill this floor no longer needed daily was a skill this floor no longer needed to maintain at all. You're right, and I think some part of me has known that since long before this afternoon, he said. I just didn't want to believe it, because believing it meant admitting that the better Porsink got, the more this floor actually needed a program keeping the old skill alive underneath it, not less. What Holt and I built together over the following months was a standing mandatory manual pour drill program, twice quarterly for every certified operator regardless of Porsink's reliability record, run on real castings under real supervision rather than simulated training exercises. A program my father-in-law championed just as personally and just as publicly as he'd once championed removing that exact requirement from the certification process years earlier, closing the exact gap that had let 5 otherwise excellent years of automated reliability quietly erode the one skill this floor would need the rare day that reliability finally failed. Julio still thanks me, occasionally, over coffee in the break room, for reaching that console in 15 seconds, though he's also become, in the months since, one of the floor's most disciplined practitioners of the new drill schedule, the particular conversion of someone who's felt firsthand exactly what an unpracticed skill feels like the one moment it's suddenly needed. I still keep my own personal practice schedule, though it carries less weight now that it's simply the standard every operator on this floor follows rather than one lead operator's private insurance policy against a gap nobody else had fully reckoned with. Holt and I still talk about Porsink's ongoing refinement most weekends now, standing on the same casting floor he's worked for 38 years, except the conversation carries a specific new weight neither of us fully had before that Thursday afternoon. He told me once that the hardest part of the whole episode wasn't reinstating the drill program at all, it was sitting with how completely 5 clean years had let him believe that removing a skill's daily necessity was the same thing as removing the need for that skill entirely, right up until his own daughter-in-law's stubborn personal discipline finally made the gap impossible to keep deferring. Molten steel doesn't forgive hesitation, and what I've learned, watching a system my own father-in-law built get this one thing wrong for 5 years before finally getting it right, is that the most dangerous gap in a genuinely well-built system is often the one it creates simply by working too well for too long, quietly eroding the exact human readiness it was never designed to need again, right up until the one rare day it needs it back immediately and without warning. It took a triple beep alarm, a 15-second run across the floor, and a father-in-law and daughter-in-law who trusted each other enough to argue honestly on a casting floor 18 months before it mattered, to finally close a gap that 5 otherwise excellent years of engineering had never quite found their way to on their own.